Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today is perhaps a semi-joke, but I hope one that will be valuable to some people. This harkens back to some of the questions that were asked at one point in the, I think this was in the Submit Questions to Dennis thread. And so I don't remember the context. I think I had suggested in one of the earlier videos that someone had asked me just way too broad a question, that they were asking me to cover, the kind of thing that one could spend books writing, and suggested that people ask much more terse and limited questions. And there was some kind of sarcastic, or not really sarcastic, but joking back and forth about covering the entire Sicilian in 15 minutes, including the Night-Orf and the Ruy Lopez in 10 minutes. Well, I decided that I might as well try to do that. Of course, the coverage may not be as deep as, let's say, Kasparov's videos, or even better, a monograph on these openings. But actually, I hope that for lower club players in particular, that this will do at least two things that they'll find beneficial. So one is to give kind of a lay of the land. So obviously the coverage is going to have to be pretty superficial, but it can be useful to at least see what's out there and to have some general idea of at least the main contours and ideas of some of the variations. And, well, as I said, so both the lay of the land, but also some basic information. So very strong players, of course, are probably not going to get much out of this, if anything. But I do hope that players who are on the, past beginner stage, but not super experienced, will actually gain something out of this. And, okay, maybe we'll be lucky, and even somewhat stronger players will benefit as well. All right, well, let's go ahead and begin here, and I'm giving myself a time limit of 15 minutes for the Sicilian, so here we go. All right, so e4, c5. This is the Sicilian, of course, and it's a very, very sharp, very fighting opening, and the main reason why it's particularly dynamic is this imbalance. So black is not trying to neutralize white, but is rather kind of taking a different approach altogether, not directly combating the white e-pawn, but going for his own independent approach. So he's controlling the d4 square. If white doesn't do anything direct and active, black will make moves like knight c6, g6, bishop g7, and fight for the dark squares. Okay, so let's continue. Knight f3 is the main move, but white has some other options that we'll very, very quickly discuss. So there's the wing gambit with b4. Okay, I don't think this is all that exciting, but it's, well, it's not all that dangerous. It is kind of fun. So best is just to take it. White usually plays a3, and then the main moves here. You can try b3. I think this is kind of interesting. And also d5. d5 is the main move. And this is typical. When you see a gambit, often you take it and then return the pawn for good clean play. Okay, another important move here, more important than b4 certainly, is c3. And then here black has a choice between two options. Now, one of the key things, by putting a pawn on c3, you can no longer put a knight on c3. So black will usually attack the e-pawn. So either knight to f6, when white will play e5, knight to d5, and then typical continuation would be something like d4 takes, knight f3. Of course, black can't take because the knight's hanging. So, okay, black has a few ways to go. One reasonably popular line here is to play e6, c takes d4, and then b6. Okay, so this is an interesting line. Knight c3, takes, queen c7, hitting the c3 pawn, bishop d2, bishop to b7, bishop d3, and now d6. And black's going to follow up with knight to d7, trying to encourage white to play ed, bishop d6, when black's bishops will both be on excellent diagonals. So you've got this bishop on this diagonal, this bishop on this diagonal, and so on. Okay. The other main approach after c3 is to play d5, and this is a bit more calm and solid. So e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3. All these moves have alternatives, but this will get us to a pretty standard kind of position. So c takes d4, c takes d4. Bishop e7, knight c3, queen d6. And here we have a pretty typical kind of isolated pawn position. Black's queen is actually pretty well posted on d6, so that way the rook or a rook can come to d8 and to exert further pressure on the d-pawn. It also prevents knight to e5 for the moment. So white generally plays knight to b5 to kick the queen back. And then on queen to d8 plays bishop to f4. Okay, on the other hand, black gets knight to d5. Bishop g3 kicks the knight back. Knight c3 castles, and so on. So it's just a very interesting line. If you like either side of the isolated pawn, then this might be a variation to investigate further. Okay. Another try for white here is the so-called Grand Prix attack, and it used to look like this: f4, and it went out of business though, this move order, thanks to the so-called tall gambit with d5 takes, and now knight f6. And for example, bishop to b5 check, bishop to d7 takes and takes. And if white doesn't protect the d-pawn, then black is just in great shape. The pawn on f4 is just kind of overextended and weakens some squares in the center. So if white wants to play this, he's got to hold on for dear life here to the material. So c4, e6, queen e2, and now bishop to d6, allowing white, if he wants, to even grab a second pawn with f5. But after castles, say fe6, fe6, d takes e6, okay, queen to e8 is one move here. Black has a really good game. He's down 2 pawns, but he's probably going to win this pawn back without too much exertion. Knight c6 is coming, threatening knight to e4. The queen can come to g6. The rook comes from a8 to e8. And we can see that black is really beautifully posted here. And he's, as I said, only going to end up 1 pawn down. So, Grand Prix fans have switched now to play knight to c3 instead. And after this, okay, black has a number of ways to continue. And this is a good move order for white if he wants to avoid, or if he wants to try to encourage black to avoid the knight-orf, assuming that's what black usually plays. Because, okay, let's take a look at this variation. So knight c6, f4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, say something like bishop to c4. Bishop to b5 is also important. Against this, knight to d4 is the standard move. And if, for example, castles, I think this is a line that Gingy used to recommend on his DVDs. I think black is actually in very good shape at the end of all of this. So knight f6, d4, c4, knight e5, knight takes d5, and so on. And black is okay. All right, so going back to the position with bishop to c4. Here black plays e6. Okay, white either castles or plays f5. Knight g to e7. Okay, let's say fe, fe, d3, and now black plays d5. Okay, now there's certainly much more of interest still to be discussed and ascertained. Let's say bishop to b3, and now b5 is a very nice move, and it's the main move. And okay, it's a sharp, interesting position, certainly something that you should look further in the databases to further kind of plumb. And I said it's just a really, really cool and interesting line, but we'll stop at this point. All right, but what I wanted to say was, okay, notice from here, black plays d7, d5 in a single shot. And this is fairly promising. So if black plays d6 on move 2, it means he's going to lose a tempo later on. On the other hand, once you've played knight to c6, if white's goal with this move order is just to avoid the knight-orf, well, now he can go back and play knight f3. And now black is committed to some other kind of Sicilian. So here, black, if he wants to try to punish white, should play something like e5. And this is another interesting line. So bishop to c4, bishop to e7, or d6, d3, d6. White plays knight to d2, and is going to try to cycle this knight to have maximum control over the d5 square. But black is okay. I mean, it's a playable variation for both sides, and was quite popular at the top level around 2000 or so. All right. Well, let's turn now to some more open approaches. Oh, I should also mention the closed Sicilian. So knight c3, knight c6, and now instead of an immediate f4, white can play g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, say d3, d6, and now there are various ways to continue. So there's knight 1 to e2, there's f4 followed by knight f3, and the difference between this and a Grand Prix Sicilian is the fianchetto. So white usually doesn't fianchetto this bishop on g2 in the Grand Prix, preferring to leave this diagonal open, so that way white can play queen e1, queen h4, and f5, bishop h6, and so on, and go for a quick kill. So the closed Sicilian can be aggressive. It's a line where white can try to build up on the king side, but it's a more positional approach than the Grand Prix attack. Black, from his point of view, is going to play rook to b8, b5, b4, and go for queenside counterplay. And you can have these interesting races that result. And I would suggest that people check out the 1968 match between Spassky and Giller. They had 3 or 4 games in this variation. Spassky won 2 or 3 of them, but 3 of them, I believe. But they were all quite close, and only the last game was really clean start to finish, and the other ones, Giller had chances. All right, so now we'll finally move to the main move here. Oh, I won't bother to say anything really about the Smith-Morra. CD, C3. Here, though, if you want to decline, you should play knight to f6 rather than d5. So d5 isn't good here. You can also play d3. It's a little bit of a passive approach, but it's playable. And, of course, you can accept the gambit, and that leads to very sharp play. There you need to know what you're doing. Okay, so back to here. Knight f3. And now, all right, black has a number of moves. Okay, so you can play g6. This goes into the so-called accelerated dragon. So d4 takes, knight takes, bishop g7. And here white has a choice. You can either play knight to c3, which leads to typical dragon variations, regular dragon variations, or he can play c4 and attempt with these pawns on c4 and e4 to exert a kind of clamp on black's game. So this tends to be a bit more drawish. Usually either white wins by grinding his opponent to death, or it ends up as a draw. It's a tougher line for black to try to gain winning chances against, though of course there are different things that black can use in the attempt to do so. Okay, so that's 2g6. Knight f6 is a kind of an oddball line. I think it's named after Nimzovich, and this is how it continues. There are some very interesting variations here, but all I'm going to do is just alert you to its existence, but not discuss it further at the moment. So that leaves the main moves here, which are knight to c6, e6, and d6. Okay, a6 can be played too, but it seems like there are at least a couple of good ways to go. You can play c3, which would be my preference. You can also play c4 and go into a kind of Maroczy bind or hedgehog type of structure. All right, but knight c6, e6, and d6 are the big moves. Okay, so knight to e6, knight to c6, and now here white could play c3 and keep it in c3 Sicilian if you like certain lines where black's knight goes to c6. But the two main moves are d4 and bishop to b5. So after bishop to b5, black has 3 reasonable moves. There's d6, which is kind of a halfway house move. The idea is to play bishop to d7. Against this, white will often castle and play c3 and d4, maybe with rook to e1 thrown in first, and this becomes kind of like a Ruy Lopez in some ways. An interesting line for white that can also occur via different move orders is d4, and after cd, queen d4, bishop d7, takes, c4 can be played, but the main move and the most interesting move is knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, e6, castles queenside, bishop e7, and this can lead to surprisingly sharp play. A very nice game that you can check out was played between the old former Soviet Grandmaster Evgeny Vasyukov, and he destroyed Van Wely in a game from the Aeroflot Open in the early 2000s. Very nice game to look at. Judy Polgar also played this a few times. Judith Polgar played this a few times when she was a teenager as well. Okay, so after bishop to b5, there's d6. There's also e6. And here, if white takes on c6, black will recapture with the b pawn. Otherwise, he'll play knight to e7 and then play a6. In fact, I covered a game in this line earlier tonight on my chess-based show. So that was Akopian Kasparov, in Russia versus the rest of the world back in 2002, and Akopian destroyed Kasparov in the game, but the opening was fine for Black. He just didn't respond very well to the position that arose in the middle game. Okay, and then the main move here, instead of d6 or e6, is g6. And after this, the usual move is bishop takes c6, and here Black takes with the d-pawn. So not in the e6 line, but in this line he does. And the idea here for Black, or one possible plan, is to play bishop g7, bishop g4, take, castle, knight f6, knight d7, e5, knight f8, knight e6. So I've drawn a lot of stuff on the board, but basically the whole thing is geared towards the d4 square. So the bishop on g7, the pawn on e5, the knight on e6, or even going on to d4, the pawn on c5, the queen on d8. So all of these units support or control the d4 square, and bishop c8 to g4 takes f3 gets rid of a piece that doesn't help, but it does help indirectly by getting rid of White's one of White's pieces that controls d4. All right, so White has various plans as well, but just giving one common way in which Black continues. Okay, so that's knight c6, bishop to b5. All right, the main move here is d4, though bishop to b5 is quite popular too. And now c takes d4, knight takes d4, and again Black has lots of choices. There's g6, which again is going to lead into various kinds of dragons, either a regular kind of dragon or an accelerated dragon with c4. There's e6, which is leads to the Paulsen / Kahn / Taimanov, and here White has many ways to play. You can play knight to b5. This tends to go into a kind of a hedgehog setup after d6, c4. There's a6 and some really fun variations here. Knight d6 takes, and I believe queen to e7 is the main move. And now, okay, I think the simplest way for White to play is just to take and play knight c3. Okay, actually the lines that are more like this, that are more common, are with e5. And this leads into some very interesting directions. So knight to b5, and now, okay, a6, knight d6, takes, queen f6, and then if White plays queen to d1, all kinds of crazy things happen. So queen to g6, hitting the pawn on e4, knight c3, and now Black can play either knight g to e7, which is slightly restrained, or the really insane d5. And after d5, then knight takes d5, queen e4, bishop e3, knight d4, knight c7 check, king e7, and this is just a very messy position. White's best is either rook to c1 or queen to d3, not grabbing the rook, but taking care of his c-pawn. So bishop to g4, queen d3 now, takes, bishop takes, rook d8, and who knows what's going on here. All right, back to knight to b5. A very popular move now is d6. This is called the Kalashnikov. And okay, here White can either play c4 or knight 1 to c3. These are the two main moves. And in both cases, White is going for control over the d5 square, while Black is going to try to exert a lot of influence in the center by basically just having a lot of pawns there. So play bishop e7, bishop e6, well, okay, probably f5 first, then knight f6. And Black will often get some good attacking chances on the king side. White's hoping that his control over the light squares in d5 in particular will outweigh it. Also, this knight on b5 is often going to end up losing some time, dropping back to a3. Okay, so that's e5. The most popular move here is knight to f6, and after knight c3, e5, knight d to b5, d6. We have one of the most popular variations in all of chess. This is the so-called Sveshnikov variation. Again, like the Kalashnikov, White has a death grip on d5, but Black is going to get counterplay with by various means. So by going for the f5 advance, most especially, but also by kicking this knight, which is going to have to waste an awful lot of time coming back into the game. So play typically continues like this: bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5, and now White has two main moves that are both extremely popular and important. So one is to play knight to d5. This is the more positional approach. Bishop e7, takes, c3, castles, knight c2. So white is bringing this knight back into the game, where it's going to help in the fight for d5. Black is going to go for his own play here. So bishop to g5, and he's going to go for f5 or g6 and then f5. All right, so that's one variation. A lot of fun. Going back here, the other approach for white is to play bishop takes f6, g takes f6. See, black can't play queen takes f6 any longer. So there's some weaknesses, you might say, but also black has even more center pawns to work with now. So after knight to d5, there's again a major parting of the ways. There's f5, and there's bishop to g7. And both can lead to really wild play. It's a lot of fun. It's certainly at club level, it's a great way to play for a win with the black pieces. All right, so that's knight c6. Okay, next e6, and we're over time here, but I'll go for a couple more minutes here. So d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and again black has a lot of choices. So there's knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. Now, if white plays knight d to b5, this can turn back into the Sveshnikov. So d6, bishop f4, e5, bishop g5, and both sides have made an extra move to reach the position that we already saw. On the other hand, white can play knight takes c6, and this leads to a very interesting play as well. B takes c6, e5, knight to d5, knight to e4, queen c7, drawing this pawn up to f4 first, and now queen to b6, taking a little bit of aim here at this e3 square. Okay, c4, and now the main move, well, knight to e3 is played, but bishop to b4 check is the most common move, pretty much forcing king to e2, because if he blocks with the piece, if you play bishop to d2, then knight to e3 could be awkward, and I think there are some other moves that are okay as well, but it's the weakness of the e3 square makes it inferior. So king to e2 is the best move, f5, knight f2, bishop to a6, and king f3. And this just leads into all kinds of mischief, very crazy positions. Again, this was popular around 2000, 2001. It seemed like white was getting some edges there, but it's certainly playable. Okay, so after knight d4, knight f6 is one approach. Okay, there's also a6. This is the Khan variation, K-A-N, and not to be confused with the Karo Khan guy, and not to be confused with the Wrath of Khan either. So all different Khans, and not C-O-N, not a convict. Okay, so anyway, after a6, black is delaying his kingside development and developing any pieces really. But the idea, okay, of course he's keeping white pieces off of b5, often a dangerous square for black, preparing to play b5 in some cases, also really preparing to play queen to c7 where he won't have to worry about any knight to b5 annoyances. Furthermore, still another idea behind a6 is that it's just flexible, and black is waiting to see how exactly white arranges his pieces, and then he'll try to use that information to more effectively deploy his own forces. Okay, another popular variation here, very popular, is knight c6, the Taimanov. I would say most properly it's a Taimanov as opposed to a Paulson. When black ends up playing knight g to e7, I mean, historically speaking, that's what Taimanov was. That was kind of the distinctive that he added to the line, though he contributed to all the variations of this. Anyway, after knight c6, I already mentioned white can play knight to b5, can play knight to c3. Actually, I don't think I mentioned knight to c3, so I mentioned knight to b5. So here, again, black has all kinds of choices. He can play knight to f6, and then after knight to b5, we're back into the Sveshnikov. He can play the so-called pin variation. Well, okay, no, this isn't quite the pin variation here. It's bishop to b4. That's in line with knight f6, and then bishop to b4. Black can play d6, which is kind of a pseudo-classical, pseudo-Scheveningen variation. But the main moves would be a6, knight f6, and queen c7. So this, and often all of these will be played. So a6, knight f6, queen c7, and then bishop to b4. So very interesting line called the Taimanov. White has any number of ways of arranging his forces too. He can go for an English attack style formation with bishop e3, f3, queen d2, and castles. He can play kind of a slower build-up line with bishop to e3, and then bishop e2 or bishop to d3, castle kingside, and play f4. And there are various other possibilities as well. So it's a really flexible line and quite interesting. I should also mention the possibility in the knight c6 lines, but it comes up in other places too. Takes, takes. That there are some people like to play moves like queen to b6. And this brings up an important idea in many Sicilians. So this knight on d4 is well posted. So with queen to b6, black is strongly encouraging knight to b3. Now, white's going to gain a tempo later on by playing bishop to e3, and black will usually drop the queen back to c7. But the point for black is that white's knight on b3 is not an aggressive piece, whereas on d4 it can be. It aims at e6, at b5, at f5, all of which are squares that have seen bad things happen to black in many past Sicilians. So, okay, the knight on b3 is solid. If white castles queenside, it helps to defend, but it's not aggressively posted. So this is kind of an interesting thematic idea in many Sicilians as well. Okay, so now let's go back to knight f3, and we'll discuss the absolute main move, d6. Okay, so d4 takes, queen takes. We've already mentioned before in a different move order that this can be a lot of fun after knight c6, bishop b5, and so on. But let's just focus on the main move. So knight takes d4, knight whoops, hit the wrong square, knight f6, knight c3, and now black has four major moves. Alright, so there's knight c6, this is the classical Sicilian. There's e6, this is the Scheveningen. There's g6, which is very popular, especially among youngsters, the dragon, and youngsters for many generations. And then there's the probably most popular variation historically in all of chess, certainly since the 50s, when it really came into prominence, and that's the Neidorf variation. Okay, so, all right, we're definitely over time, so we'll just make this whole show on the Sicilian. We'll try to at least keep it relatively short. So we're at about 25 minutes or so on the coverage of just the Sicilian after the first couple of minutes of intro talk. All right, so let's go through these one at a time. e6 is the Scheveningen. Against this, white has many ways of playing. There's the kind of quiet approach with bishop e2, bishop e3, castles, f4, and so on, though this can sharpen up. Let's take a quick look. So bishop to e2, bishop e7, castles, castles, bishop e3, knight c6, and now f4, a6, and now white has three major moves here. So there's a4, simply preventing b5 outright. Black plays queen c7, which is important because white wants to play e5 at some convenient moment. So black wants to keep e5 under control. There are some lines where he plays rook to d8, though the most popular lines involve rook to e8. And where white will sharpen this up is with the move g4, g5. So not yet, but this happens quite often. So king h1, rook e8, say bishop to f3, rook to b8, and now g4. And so white's idea is to play g5, bishop g2, rook f3, rook h3, and queen to h5. And sometimes queen goes to e1 and then to h4 with good attacking prospects. So it's just a very interesting and very sharp line. All right. Sometimes white tries to economize and not bother with a6. He'll just do something else useful, and only after b5 play a3. So for instance here, king to h1 is another move. And very often when white plays f4 in open Sicilians, he'll play king to h1 to avoid any diagonal problems. So again, king h1, queen c7. This again takes guard over e5 and prepares b5, so the knight's not hanging. Also prepares the idea of knight takes d4 followed by e5. So white will often play a4 here. That'll just transpose, but also queen to e1. So after queen e1, then knight takes, bishop takes, b5, a3. We don't want to allow b4 and the attack on this guy. So bishop to b7, queen g3, which indirectly protects the pawn because knight takes e4 allows queen takes g7 mate. So here bishop to c6 is common with the idea of queen to b7, just really trying to pile up on this e-pawn. And okay, it just leads to a very interesting play. Rook a to e1, queen to b7, bishop d3, b4, takes, takes, knight e2, and so on. Queen e7 or b7, I believe. And okay, study the theory. There's lots of games with this, and it's quite interesting. Okay, finally, after a6, there's also queen to e1 straight away. And, okay, so again, queen c7, and, okay, king h1 will probably transpose into the king to, 10 king to h1 line. So queen g3 is the distinctive move. Again, takes, and now not e5, so white's got it adequately guarded. That's one of the advantages of this move order. But, okay, b5, a3, bishop b7, and white could play rook a to e1, but usually plays king h1, and then after bishop c6, we've just transposed into what we had before. All right, so that's one major line of this e6 system. But a move that scares a lot of people off from playing the Scheveningen is g4, the so-called Keres attack. And see, in many variations, white has to prepare this g4 thrust, which is quite useful. He wants to play g5, kick away black's great knight on f6, where this knight helps to defend the king side, and also helps support counterplay against white's e-pawn. So the fact that white gets g4 in very easily is really kind of a discouraging factor for black, and so the Scheveningen is less popular now than it used to be. So it's certainly playable, but it's, again, comparatively less common than the other choices here. Well, actually, okay, knight to c6 is also only semi-popular. Here white has three main approaches. So there's the old-fashioned bishop to e2, black plays e5, and whether white plays knight to b3 or knight to f3, we end up with a rather positional game, somewhat reminiscent in certain ways of the Scheveningen, but black has fewer attacking prospects in this line than he does there. Not Scheveningen, the Sveshnikov, sorry. So this is really the positional approach for white. But black is supposed to be doing pretty well. To see some successful games in this variation for white that are relatively recent, you might want to check out the mini match between Dibiendo Barua and Alexander Halifman from the 1999 Las Vegas KO Championship. So it was played in the first round of that event. Halifman won it and became the FIDE knockout champion, but he had a terrible time with Barua, who beat him 2 or 3 times in this variation, and Halifman had to keep equalizing the score and only finally beat him deep into the tiebreaks to win the match. All right, so bishop e2 is one interesting line. Now, a really super fascinating line is bishop to c4, and after e6, we mentioned that queen to b6 is also common here. This is an idea of Benko's. We already saw the point of this: drive the knight from its active location, even at the cost of a tempo to the queen. All right, but bishop c4, e6, bishop e3, bishop e7, and now white can take kind of a positional approach, relatively positional approach, with bishop to b3 and castling short. But the really fun line is the Velimirovich attack with queen to e2, and white just throws the kitchen sink at black. So, for instance, a6, castles, queen c7, bishop b3, castles, g4. Okay, knight takes d4 is the main move, rook takes d4, but just to show some of the really crazy lines, so knight to d7, rook h to g1, knight c5, say knight f5 here, b5, bishop to d5, and white continues to just put pieces en prise, but throws everything at black, including the kitchen sink, and it's really leads to just delightful games. I mean, just so exciting. So if you're in a depressed mood about chess, look for this position and dig up some old games, and you'll see some really beautiful chess being played. Okay, so that's the second line against knight c6. The most common line, and I would say theoretically the best line, is bishop to g5. And, okay, most common play here is e6, though bishop to d7 is increasingly popular. So e6, queen d2, and now black has a lot of ways to proceed. The main moves are bishop to e7, and especially a6. All right, so white castles long in this variation, bishop to d7, and here white sometimes plays f3 with the idea of stabilizing this e-pawn, and then playing, often like an English attack, g4, bishop e3, g5, h4, and so on. Just throw everything at black's kingside. The other approach is to play f4. And, okay, this leads to a looser center, but it's a more direct approach. So like b5, bishop takes f6, g takes f6, king b1, queen b6, knight takes c6, bishop c6, queen e1, the idea is sometimes of f5, of e5, and also of knight to d5. And okay, it's just another interesting variation. So black's got the bishop pair and has this structure, which is very characteristic of the Rouser line, this bishop g5 line against knight c6, which is the classical. So it's a nice wall. If white can breach it, then black will often have serious troubles. But if it stays there and black survives to a late middle game or an ending, it can be in great shape. One thematic idea to mention, white sometimes likes to play bishop e2, h5, exerting some further pressure, and especially in conjunction with f5, that can really be annoying for black. So very often when white plays bishop to e2 in some position, black will himself play h5 to prevent white's bishop to h5. Okay, so that's the Rouser. Next up, we've got the Dragon. All right, so this ever popular variation. And here white can play positionally with moves like bishop to e2, bishop g7, castles, castles, and so on. Okay, this is really a positional treatment. But the really fun stuff occurs with bishop to e3. All right, so bishop g7, f3, castles, queen d2, knight c6, and now white has a big choice here. Black has a positional threat of d5, which generally puts him in good shape. So white's main move here is bishop to c4. But sometimes white plays castling long. Actually, it's quite a common move. And, okay, if black doesn't play d5, then white will often save a couple of tempi, not moving this bishop to c4 and then back to b3, and then often capturing a knight on c4. So by leaving this bishop at home on f1, you can save up to 2 tempi. On the other hand, of course, black can play d5 here. And, all right, white has a bunch of moves here. There's queen to e1, which is interesting. There's king to b1, which often leads to a fascinating queen sack line with knight takes d4, e5, knight f5, e takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes d5, and now queen takes d5. So queen d5, knight e3, queen d2 or d3 comes to the same thing. Takes, takes, bishop e6, white plays bishop e5 and follows with bishop a4 and b3. And, okay, we end up in a position where black has a rook and a bishop for the queen, but a very solid structure. His bishops are very nice, especially the bishop on f6. As white retreats his bishop, black will advance his queenside pawns. And, okay, white maybe has a small advantage here, but it's just another playable line. And one where black seems to be in okay shape. So that's king to b1. Queen e1, as I said, is also common. And the main move is e takes d5. So knight takes d5, knight c6, bc6, bishop d4. He can take this pawn, but it doesn't seem to be all that impressive, or at least traditionally it hasn't been viewed all that highly. So queen c7. Queen takes a8 is not very good because of bishop to f5, so we've got this mate threat here, as well as the attack on the queen, so white's forced to take, king takes, and then rook to d2. So no big deal there. So the more important move is queen to c5. Black plays queen to b7, keeping the queens on, and okay, white's up a pawn, but all the lines around his king are open, so it's not clear that he should really be all that happy. So instead of playing knight takes d5 and grabbing the pawn, the main move here is bishop to d4. Okay, now black plays various things here. Bishop takes d4, queen d4, queen b6 is one line. Another line is knight takes c3, queen c3, bishop to h6 check, bishop to e3, takes, takes, queen b6. I remember Greg Shahade used to play this with black. In fact, I remember having a blitz game with him a long time ago. I think I won this, but okay, it's just another line where white's somewhere between slightly better and equal, and you know, you just keep playing and whatever happens. But it's playable for both sides. But the main move, the most dynamic approach for white is, or sorry, for black, though theoretically white seems to be in good shape, is with e5. So knight c3, the line that I just mentioned that Greg used to play, is a more solid approach. This is a more dangerous approach, but probably more dangerous for black than white. So bishop c5, bishop e6. White never takes the rook here. Knight e4, rook e8, h4, h6, g4, queen c7, say g5, h5, bishop c4, and rook e to d8, queen f2. Okay, and this is just a theoretical position. It's been deeply explored. No final results have been concluded yet. All right, so that's what happens in these castles d5 lines. All right, there's bishop to c4 as well. And now, again, lots of possibilities for black. I'll just give a main line. Bishop d7, castles, rook c8, so threatening to take on d4, so the bishop has to retreat. Knight e5, h4, h5, so blocking this, the so-called Soltis variation. Bishop to g5, rook c5, king b1, b5, g4, a5, and as you can see, I mean, just all kinds of crazy things are going to happen. And there are many other sub-variations here, but this common theme of white going crazy trying to attack on the king side and black going for counterplay on the queen side is part and parcel of the variation, and really what makes it so much fun and so exciting. I mean, black is going to give just as good as he gets, and both sides have their chances. The games are really tactical. Preparation is very important, but also having a lot of tactical self-confidence, and it's just, as I said, it's a lot of fun. Okay, so that's the second most popular Sicilian variation, but the king of them all is the Najdorf with a6. And now white has many different approaches. But I think what I'm going to do is maybe postpone that for another time. Nah, I'll go on here. I'll finish this up. Okay, so white has a lot of approaches, but let's briefly discuss, okay, sorry to vacillate here on you, but I think I should save this for another time. So, given kind of a super duper overview of almost every Sicilian variation, at least said something about it. I know it was kind of fast. Of course, you guys can watch this again. I don't think I'm going to make a habit of doing this kind of video, but I just thought it would be amusing to give this a try, especially given the little banter back and forth about this idea. So discuss the Najdorf a little bit more carefully in a subsequent video. And I'm curious. I mean, you may think this was an absolutely worthless video. You might find this kind of interesting or amusing. So, I mean, what I'm hoping again is that lower-rated players especially will have gained something out of this, and even players in kind of the middle ranges will at least be more aware of some variations that they'd never seen or played before, and about some themes, maybe even in variations that they did know a little bit about. So, I hope I wasn't speaking so fast that it was difficult to get anything. So again, it's experimenting. Get some feedback from you guys. And hopefully there was at least some benefit to be gained out of this. So, of course, I'm not going to rush through 50 variations every single show, but I hope that there was at least some value for you guys in this. So thanks a lot. Don't forget to check out my blog at chessmind.powerblogs.com, chessmind.powerblogs.com. So that's it. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.